It's the start of Booker Prize season. Hey everyone, I'm Eric from Lonesome Reader, and 2 weeks from today, that is on Wednesday, July 24th, the long list for this year's Booker Prize is going to be announced. And I've already started getting emails from some people who are speculating about what might be on the list and asking for my opinion of what might be on this year's list. And so I thought I would make another video like I did last year, predicting what books we might see on the list this year. And I don't have any special insight into the prize, but I know a lot of people aren't up on UK publishing schedules and what might be eligible for the prize, so I thought it's a good I can give an indication of what we might see on the list this year and some likely candidates. Through my scientific deduction process to try to figure out what might be on the list, but also just picking some of my favorites that I've read over the past year that we might see on this year's list. So I'm gonna go through talking about all of them, but also talking a bit generally at first about the prize and maybe speculating about some things that we might see on this year's prize list, because there was a lot of surprises on last year's long list. So yeah, it'll be interesting. So it'll be 12 or 13 books that they'll pick. It's usually called the Booker Dozen, but last year it was 13 books that were on the long list. And this year, it's important to note as well at the start that it is just called the Booker Prize this year, not the Man Booker Prize anymore, because the sponsorship has changed. Their new main sponsor is called Crankstart, which is a charitable foundation, and thankfully this organization isn't attaching their name to the Booker Prize name, because Crankstart Booker Prize or Booker Crankstart Prize would have just sounded a bit odd, wasn't it? So yeah, it's nice that it's just going to be known as the Booker Prize, and then the Booker International Prize, which they have in the spring, it's just going to be known as that from now on. And I like that book prizes are sort of being sleek, having these like sleek names now. So now it's just known as the Women's Prize, and now this is just known as the Booker Prize. Another interesting thing to note is the judges on this year's prize. So there's 5 judges, and there's four women and 1 man on the judge prize. It's going to be interesting to see what the balance of genders is that comes out in the long list this year. So and the judges are really interesting. So there's Peter Florence, who was the founder of the Hay Festival. This is a great book festival which happens in Wales. I've only been once, but I've wanted to go back because they get such great guests there to speak and really interesting authors, and it's just a lovely environment out in the country in this town, which is full of bookshops, and so it's just lovely to visit. There's Afua Hirsch, and she's a writer and broadcaster. She wrote a very popular nonfiction book called Brit-ish. The ish is in parentheses, and that's talking about race, identity, and belonging. And there is Liz Calder, who was one of the founders of Bloomsbury Publishing, and she's been a publisher for a long time, and she's helped foster the careers of Salman Rushdie and Margaret Atwood and Michael Ondaatje and Julian Barnes. So, she's someone who really knows literature for the past 50 years, and a lot of people who have gone on to win the Booker Prize, so very knowledgeable. Then there's Shalu Guo, who's a Chinese-British writer and novelist, and also a filmmaker. And I read her novel I Am China, which I really enjoyed. She quite often writes about language and sort of translation as a way of describing identity, what parts of us are like. Parts of our national identity are wrapped up in our language. And then there's Joanna McGregor, who's a musician and conductor and composer who's collaborated with a lot of writers on different musical projects. And so, yeah, really interesting group of judges. And so I'm sort of hoping from this group that we'll have, a good, balanced gender list, but also a kind of good level of diversity amongst the authors listed, and hopefully books published from sort of smaller publishers as well as bigger publishers, to have a good mix of that, because I think a lot of the smaller publishers struggle to get books into prize lists, and it does such a big thing when a book from a small publisher wins a prize, because raises all this visibility for them that they wouldn't have otherwise. And I'm sort of hoping this year that we'll see, ever since a few years ago when Americans became eligible for the Booker Prize, the list has been weighted a lot with American authors and British authors, but not as much anymore with the former Commonwealth countries that are also eligible for the prize. And so we haven't seen as many novelists from South Africa or Australia or New Zealand or the Caribbean. But I'm sort of hoping that, this year we'll get some more books from, in places like India. Indian authors used to be nominated a lot more for the prize. And so, it'll be, I'm sort of hoping, that we'll see a wide diversity on the list. But, I never try to get too focused on these sort of identity labels for authors, because really it's just all about the book. But I think it's good to look over time, the sort of balance that you get amongst nominated books, because it's important that there's a good level of representation. So the books under consideration are ones that were written in English and published between October 1st, 2018 and September 30th, 2019. And so, of course that means some books might be listed for the prize that haven't even been published yet. And this is always a sort of contentious thing with prizes when a list will come out and the books aren't available yet. And this happened earlier this year with the Man Booker International Prize. And I think 2 of the books on the long list weren't actually published yet. But what will probably happen, if that does happen, again with this year's Booker list, is that the publishers might rush the publication of those books and bring them out sooner, so they'll actually be available and people can read them before either the shortlist or the winner is announced. I think that's quite likely to happen. And another thing, if you want to be sort of savvy trying to figure out what books might be on the list, it's important to look at publishers too, because the way the rules work for the Booker Prize is that if you've had books nominated in the past, you're able to submit more for the next year's prize. So there's a whole number of publishers that have had fairly good representation on Booker lists in the previous years. So there's like One World and Faber and Serpent's Tail, Picador, Granta Books, Hamish Hamilton, Bloomsbury, John Murray, Fourth Estate. So, it's a lot of publishers, but if you want to be really canny, I'm not going to be totally scientific at all, but I did sort of think about books brought out by those publishers this year and ones that they might want to put forward for this year's prize. So, of course, the winner for last year's prize was Anna Burns for her novel Milkman, and this was published by Faber. And I think this was a big surprise for everybody, and nobody really saw this coming. I'd sort of seen this book and been aware of it before the prize announcement, but hadn't read it, and I don't think a lot of people had. But it's sort of skyrocketed and now has become so well known. So a book that when it was first published was published to relative obscurity, and now it's been nominated for multiple prizes in the past year since it won the Booker Prize, and most recently it won the Orwell Prize for political fiction. So Anna Burns, she keeps going on to more success. And of course I had mixed feelings about this book, but it's wonderful to see a book that went from not many people having read it and known about it to now being one of the most well-read books in the past year. And so I think that just shows the power of the Booker Prize and what it can do to help spread the word about fiction that's been coming out. So that's I just always find it really exciting. And so I've gone through and tried to suss out a list of books that I think are eligible and we're likely to see on the list. I've used a wide array. I don't know why I suddenly started to sound like that. I've picked 103 books. Yeah, that's a lot. But I think even though I've picked all these books to mention, I'm not going to talk about them all in depth, but just to mention some of the ones that I'm really hoping to see. I'll talk about them a lot, but most of them I'll just mention. And I think even though I've named all these books, I think we still might get a lot of surprises on the list, and ones I won't even have thought of and wouldn't have ever heard of before, because that's what happened with the list last year. I was really surprised. But I think you can be a bit canny and figure out at least ones that are sort of up for the prize and or are likely to be nominated. And and of course we don't know what's been submitted for the prize. So even if there's a book we really support and think is highly likely, the publisher just might not have submitted it for whatever reason. So we'll have to see how it goes. So right, starting off, I'm going to begin with a novel which was published way back in October of last year, and so probably a lot of people won't think of it, but it is eligible for this year's prize, and that's Barbara Kingsolver's novel Unsheltered. And I really enjoyed this novel. I mean, she's a masterful storyteller. It's not a perfect novel, but it's really interesting, talking about a lot of current themes. So yeah, I highly enjoyed it. A sort of dual narrative that takes place in the past and roughly the present day, and talking about the sort of the evolution of community and the meaning of home over time, and the struggles that individuals feel in a government ruled by sort of conservative forces, so I found it a fascinating novel. Then there's Leila by Prayaag Akbar. This is a novel which is about the caste system in India, and it's a sort of dystopian novel taking place in the near future where actual physical walls have been built up between members of different communities, and the novel follows the story of a woman trying to find out what happened to her daughter, who was taken from her once, and the many years that have gone past, and how she's strategically tried to wait to get to a period where she can at least find out what happened to her daughter. And I found it a very emotional story. It's not a perfect novel, but it's really interesting and quite well done. So I think might see that on the list. Then there's Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. And how exciting would it be if this book was on the list this year? Because Marlon James has won the prize before, of course, but this is a very different sort of novel form. So it's a fantasy novel set in a medieval Africa and about warring kingdoms and a group of people who go on a sort of basically adventure to find out what has happened to a missing boy, it's very violent, very sexual, but I loved it. And of course, this was one of the most hyped books this year, and a lot of people, since it's been published, have had mixed feelings about it, which I understand. But I think it's a brilliant novel and very intricate, and there's so much more to discover, I know, if I went back and reread it. So yeah, I think it'd be very exciting if it was on the list this year. And as shown from last year's list, when there was a crime novel on the list and a graphic novel on the list, they're starting to incorporate different kinds of books, not just the traditional literary fiction into the Booker Prize list. So yeah, it'd be exciting to see a fantasy novel on this year's list. Then there's When All Is Said by Griffin. This is an Irish novel about a man who's reflecting on his life and thinking about some of the most important people that have been in his life. He's just in a pub sort of reflecting on all of this, but it's actually a really gripping story in the way there's lots of twists and turns to it, and about this man's start in very humble beginnings to being a prominent landowner and very successful man. Then there's Where Reasons End by Yiyun, and this really heartbreaking, beautiful novel of an imagined conversation between a mother and her son who has committed suicide. And it's very thoughtful, but also really heartwarming to see the relationship between these two that takes place mostly in dialogue, and how that develops over the course of the novel. Then there's The Friend by Sigrid Nunez. This was published by Virago Books earlier this year, and I think it won the National Book Award in America. Is that right? And it's about a woman reflecting about her friend who's committed suicide, and her friend left her his pet dog for her to take care of, and about her experiences taking care of it. And it's just a really interesting reflection on literary life and ambition and the meaning of friendship. And I found it a very moving novel. Then there's Lanny by Max Porter, and Max Porter's one of the most exciting British authors that is working today. So this is his second novel, and like his first novel, it's done in a very strange style, but it's about a boy in a village and a kind of mythical local figure called Dead Papa Toothwort, and follows their experiences together when this boy goes missing and how his parents react to that, and also a local artist who is sort of mentoring this boy, and about their crazy story. He invokes all the voices of the villagers into this, and yeah, I thought it was a really incredible, fascinating novel, talking a lot about Britain today and what that means, and yeah, it's so fascinating. Then there's Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli. This was longlisted for the Women's Prize this year, and is just a fascinating novel. Basically, at least the first half of the novel is a road trip novel about a family traveling across country, documenting and picking up pieces of voices and sounds across of America, and yeah, I think it's really fascinating talking about the immigrant experience in America and the meaning of citizenship and who we allow in countries and who we don't allow in countries, and the real human repercussions of that. Then An American Marriage by Tayari Jones, which won the Women's Prize this year and was published by One World earlier this year, so is eligible for the prize. And so yeah, obviously a lauded novel, and it'll be yeah, really interesting to see if that continues on with the Booker Prize, because the Milkman was shortlisted for the Women's Prize this year, so it'd be a sort of funny nod if the winner of the Women's Prize this year is then on the long list for the Booker Prize, and that sort of cycle of prizes as it goes. You Will Be Safe Here by Damien Barr, which is a really moving, impactful novel set in South Africa, although Damien Barr is a Scottish author, and it takes place at two different ends of a century, looking at the stories of a woman at this beginning of the century in South Africa who gets caught in the Boer War and is put in a concentration camp, and a boy in recent times, I think maybe like a decade ago when it's set, who's put into a camp by his parents in an effort to make him more masculine. And so it's about their individual stories, but also about the way that as a society we create these organizations and institutions like camps, which are meant to foster people, but really ends up destroying them. And there's The Doll Factory by Elizabeth MacNeil, and this is a brilliant historical novel set in the mid-1800s about a woman who wants to be an artist, and how she comes under the tutorship of a man involved in the pre-Raphaelite movement, and also another man who becomes obsessed with her. And it's a really gripping story with a lot of intricate detail, one of these historical novels that just brings alive London from that period of time, and yeah, I just adored it. Then we have The Heavens by Sandra Newman. This was one of my favorite books of the year so far. Really fascinating novel, and unlike anything I've read before. So yeah, I would highly expect to see this on the list this year. It's about a woman in roughly contemporary times in New York, but who falls asleep and imagines herself, or actually travels back in time to Elizabethan times, and is a figure there who becomes involved with Shakespeare. And yeah, it's a wild story, but it's also about shifting time periods and the degree to which we can shape the future, or the degree to which we can shape the past. And yeah, so it's about history and what history means, and how that's interpreted. And yeah, it's about so much, and yeah, I just think it's incredibly fascinating. And there's This Brutal House by Niven Govindan. This is a novel about drag mothers who go on protest in front of City Hall in New York City for the children from their drag houses who have gone missing. These are young people who have been turned out from their biological families, and they find a new family with these drag mothers. But then, of course, that raises its own complications. And so he gets into the challenging chemistry of the makeup of these families, and what family means and what realness means, because these people experience a lot of things being told to them the way society is, but they know that their reality is something very different, and something which isn't accepted. And so yeah, it's interesting how he shows the dialogue between these different communities, and there is a lot of dialogue in it, but also just evoking the whole atmosphere and feeling of that period in New York and the whole drag ball scene. It's just wonderfully done. And there's An Honest Man by Ben Ferguson. This novel I just read recently and takes place in the year just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and follows the life of a teenage boy who, who isn't an angel, who acts like a bit of a dick, honestly, and several of the characters in the novel call him that, but who's sort of discovering himself, and he meets a man who he falls passionately for, but then he gets involved in the complicated this whole complicated espionage story and the Cold War politics that were taking place. And there's lots of twists and turns in the novel. It's a very thrilling novel, but also really emotional, showing this young man's development and trying to find his place in the world. Then there's An Orchestra of Minorities by Chigozie Obioma. And this is a novel which is narrated in such an interesting way, because it's about the life of a man who's a chicken farmer in Nigeria, but who, it's not narrated from his perspective, but the perspective of his chi, who is this kind of spiritual advisor that lives alongside him throughout his life and is narrating and commenting upon his life. And so it's really fascinating. I mean, I don't think it's a perfect novel. There are some aspects of it which didn't really work for me, but I think it's really fascinating. I know I've heard from a number of people that it's their favorite novel of the year, so I think it's a highly likely candidate for the list. So now I'm going to go into some established authors and former winners of the prize who I think are, it's quite likely that we might see them on this year's list. So there's We the Survivors by Tash Ah. I think he was shortlisted for the prize before. This is meant to be a really powerful novel. There's a new Thomas Keneally novel called The Book of Science and Antiquities. Linda Grant has published a new novel called A Stranger City. I Am Sovereign by NICOLA Barker. And NICOLA Barker is another one of, I think, the most exciting writers in Britain today. She's been very prolific, but produced very different sorts of novels, and her novel Happy was longlisted for the prize last year or the year before, I think, and was a fascinating novel. And I've not read this new novel, I'm Sovereign, yet. I've not read any of these novels I'm talking about in this group yet, but ones that I really want to read. And so I'm very excited about this. Then Anne Patchett has a new novel called The Dutch House, which is meant to be amazing. Hasn't been published yet. It won't be published till later in September, but she's a very revered writer. So I think it's quite likely that this might be on the list. I think it's published by Bloomsbury. Dream Sequence by Adam Foulds. I've read a novel of his before. He's really fascinating, very poetic writer, so I'm quite keen to read this. Middle England by Jonathan Coe. He's a very respected writer, and he's dealing with a lot of contemporary issues in Britain today, so this will be fascinating to read. Then, one of the big literary events of this year, Margaret Atwood is publishing her sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, which is called The Testaments, and this will be published within the eligibility date of the Booker Prize, so, could be listed. And I'm, hoping to reread The Handmaid's Tale soon, because, I'm quite excited to read this new chapter in the story and how she continues on the story. So I want to refresh my memory of what it's about rather than, just watching the TV series. Then there's Spring by Ali Smith. Now, I think Ali Smith has decided not to put her novels forward for the prize anymore, so this might not be listed, but and Criminally, I've not read Spring yet, but it's received a huge amount of praise, and there are some people who think it's the best part in her seasonal quartet so far. So this is the third book in that series, and and she's been nominated for the Booker Prize so many times before, and it'd just be wonderful if she finally read it. So I don't know what the rules are around it. Even if a author or a publisher doesn't put a book forward, I think the judges can call in some books, but I don't know if they're allowed if they specifically don't want to have their book put forward for it. So I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But I'm sure a lot of people are expecting to see Spring on this year's long list. Then there is Live a Little by Howard Jacobson, who's won the prize before. I've never been his biggest fan. I think I've read or at least read part of a couple of his novels and just haven't really got on with them. But he's much revered writer, and he always shows up on the Booker Prize party too. He just always seems to be there. Ian McEwan has a new novel, Machines Like Me, and I talked about this in my last video as well. And and Ian McEwan's another writer that I really followed when I first came to Britain and thought was really interesting, but I haven't read his books recently, just haven't been that engaged with them. Then Gun Island by Amitav Ghosh. So he's been nominated for the prize before, and I think he was shortlisted 2 years ago, or yeah, a couple of years ago. Late in the Day by Tessa Hadley. Frankenstein by Jeanette Winterson. And Jeanette Winterson is another author that when I first came to Britain, I read all of her books. I was one of her ardent followers. And but yeah, recently I haven't read as much of all of her books. I've read a couple of her recent books, but yeah, not all of them. But this is meant to be really good, her play on the Frankenstein tale. Then there, Elif Shafak has a new novel called 10 Minutes, 38 Seconds in This Strange World, which is meant to be amazing. And yeah, a book that I really want to get to. Then Colson Whitehead has a new novel called The Nickel Boys. And I know Matthew Sharapa said he thinks this novel is amazing. So yeah, I'm very excited to read this because yeah, I loved his previous novel, The Underground Railroad. Thought it was an amazing book. Deborah Levy has a new novel called The Man Who Saw Everything. I first thought this was a memoir, but it is actually a novel, I think, I'm pretty sure. Then Edna O'Brien has a new novel called Girl. And then, of course, because it's me, I have to say Joyce Carol Oates' new novel, My Life as a Rat. I'm, always hoping that Joyce will have some representation on British Prize lists, but we'll see how it goes. So, I might have got some dates wrong on this, so please don't shoot me if I've got some publication dates wrong, or if any of these aren't actually novels, so aren't eligible for the prize. I might have got a few details wrong, but I think these are all right. So, and then I just want to point out some other books which have been really critically acclaimed and I think are highly likely to be eligible for the prize. So there's Little by Edward Carey, The House of Vesper Sands by Prayaag O'Donnell. He's a really fascinating Irish writer. I've read another novel of his, and his writing is just wild. It's really fascinating. The Wall by John Lancaster, which deals with a lot of political issues, but is written in a very literary way, very symbolic way, I think. But yeah, it's a novel I really want to get to. Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. Memories of the Future by Suri Hustvedt. I love her writing. I think she's a fantastic novelist, and I've been really wanting, it's one of my most anticipated books of the year, but I've not read it yet. It was published a few months ago, and yeah, very excited to read this. The Firestarters by Jan Carson. This is a much acclaimed Irish novel. So I should say too, a couple of years ago, I think Irish publishers became eligible to submit books to the prize list. So I think we might see more Irish representation on this year's list as well. From the Wreck by Jane Rawson. This is a much acclaimed Australian novel, which I think is sort of science fiction-y and was listed for a prize in Australia. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see if this is on the list. Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl by Andrea Lawler. This is meant to be a really exciting novel. I really want to read this. Saltwater by Jessica Andrews. The Far Fields by Madhuri Vijay. This is meant to be an incredible novel, and yeah, just one I really want to get to. It's been talked about on BookTube a bit. I know Jacqueline made a whole video about it. The Rapture by Claire McGlasson. This sounds like a really fascinating novel about a closed religious society in Britain. The Hiding Game by Naomi Wood. Naomi Wood's quite involved with the Goldsmiths Prize, and yeah, this novel sounds fascinating. I think it takes place in Germany during an art movement, and yeah, it sounds really good. Plastic Emotions by Shiromi Pinto. The Other Americans by Leila Lalami. It's a much acclaimed American novel that I really want to read. 1,000 Ships by Natalie Porter. Sorry, not Natalie Porter, Natalie Haynes. Yeah, and so this is a retelling of a Greek myth, and yeah, another novel I really want to get to reading. The Old Drift by Namwali Serpal. This is another much acclaimed American novel, so yeah, I think might see this on the list. Then Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. This is one of the most hyped and acclaimed novels so far this year in Britain. Very exciting new voice in fiction, and so yeah, I think this might be likely. Then there's Bernardine Evaristo, has a new novel called Girl, Woman, Other, which I think has a very good chance of being on this year's list. Another Australian novelist called Trent Dalton. called Boy Swallows Universe. I think it's his debut novel, but was listed for an Australian prize as well, so likely to see it. On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vaughn, and this novel has been getting so much attention, and I've not read it yet, but I loved his debut poetry collection, so I've been really wanting to read this. Then there's Nightboat to Tangier by Kevin Barry, who's a very exciting Irish novelist, and yeah, it's a novel I really want to get to. Then another novel which has been getting a lot of acclaim called The Parisian by Isabella Hamad. So yeah, that's I think quite likely to be on this year's list. So those are some very likely candidates. Then I'm just very quickly gonna go through some other possibilities, some very promising authors and debuts which might be on this year's list. So there's Tisra and the Prince of Crows by Deborah K. Davies, 5 Days of Fog by Anna Freeman, Muscle by Alan Trotter, Mothlight by Adam Scoville. It's meant to be a very interesting experimental type novel from a small press, so it'd be very exciting to see that on the list. Stubborn Archivist by Yara Rodriguez. This has been quite acclaimed. I tried to read it, but I didn't really get on with this novel, but you know, I think she's a really interesting new British voice, so yeah, might be on the list. Night Theatre by Vikram Paralkar, In the Full Light of the Sun by Claire Clark, Gingerbread by Helen Oyami, The Narrow Land by Christine Dwyer-Hickey, Perfect Explanation by Eleanor Anstruther, I don't know if I'm getting that right, The Choke by Sophia Laguna, Things in Jars by Jess Kidd, Lux by Elizabeth Cook, Snegurchka by Judith Hennigan, I can never pronounce the title of this novel, Asylum by Marcus Lowe, He Is Mine and I Have No Other by Rebecca O'Connor, another really interesting new Irish author, Signet by Season Butler, The Clothesline Swing by Ahmed Dani Ramadan. This novel I'm really excited to read and that I want to get to. Animals Eat Each Other by Elle Nash, My Name is Monster by Katie Hale, The Atlas of Red and Blues by Devi S. Leskar, Ashgar and Zara by Samir Rahim, Leading Men by Christopher Castellani, Everything You Ever Wanted by Louise Sama. This is her second novel, I think. I read her first novel, which I thought was really interesting. The Mating Habits of Stags by Ray Robinson. Water Shall Refuse Them by Lucy McKnight Hardy. This is put out by a small press, meant to be a really interesting novel that just came out really recently. Zed by Joanna Cavena. Patsy by Nicole Dennis Ben, Alma Kogan by Gordon Byrne, Starling Days by Rowan Hissio Buchanan. This is being published this week, and I loved her first novel called Harmless Like Me, so yeah, very excited to read this new novel of hers. The Falconer by Dana Zepnik, Skin by E.M. Reapy, Devotion by Madeline Stevens, Beyond the Sea by Paul Lynch, Blueprint by Teresa Esneberger, This Mortal Boy by Fiona Kidman, Baby by Annalise Jochems, The Rabbit Girls by Anna Elroy, The Art of the Body by Alex Allison, The Secrets We Kept by Laura Prescott, Plume by Will Wiles. This has been getting a lot of acclaim, this novel. Confessions with Blue Horses by Sophie Hardash, Nobber by Oshin Fagan. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Oshin Fagan, maybe? If anyone Irish watching, maybe correct me if I got his name wrong. Hark by Sam Lipsyte. When We Were Rich by Tim Lott. The Snakes by Sadie Jones. I read another novel by Sadie Jones, which I really enjoyed, so I've been wanting to read this. The Age of Light by Whitney Scherer. The Runaways by Fatima Bhutto. Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This novel has been getting a lot of attention and Anna James loved it. The Gunners by Rebecca Kaufman. Rules for Visiting by Jessica Francis Kane. Lost and Wanted by Nell Freudenberger. Mostly Dead Things by Kristen Arnett. Ducks Newsburyport by Lucy Ellman. This is published by Galley Beggar Press, a novel which has just come out of theirs. It's like a 950-page tome written by an American author, but it's supposed to be brilliant, and I've just ordered a copy myself, and I think it'll hopefully get it in the post today or tomorrow. But yeah, looks like a really fascinating new novel, and of course they'd published Emer McBride when she won the Women's Prize, and so yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if, a book from a small publisher like this makes it on the Booker Prize list, if they in fact do submit it. Porpoise by Mark Haddon, The Half-God of Rainfall by Inua Elams, The Farm by Joanne Ramos, and then a novel by Elizabeth Strout, her new novel, Olive Again, which is a sequel to a previous novel. But I don't know if this is eligible, so I don't know if it's classified as short stories or a novel. If you know, let me know in the comments below. But Elizabeth Strout is a writer I really love, and I'm so excited to read this new installment to see how this character, one of her most famous characters, has developed, how she's developed her in the course of her next book. So those are all the books that I want to talk about. Yeah, a lot of books. But like I said, I'm sure there's going to be some surprises on the list that I didn't even think about and wasn't aware of. But let me know what you think. If do you just like to follow the Booker Prize just to see what's listed, or do you are you very diligent? Do you try to read all of the books that are long listed? I don't know how it's going to go this year. I will, certainly try to read all the books on the long list that I'm most interested in, and ones that I've been wanting to read anyway, because, it's always a lovely thing about book prizes that encourages me to get to the books that I've been wanting to get to, and, almost makes an excuse to finally sit down and read them. But yeah, I'll definitely at least read all of the shortlist. So let me know what your plans are, if you or if just gonna wait and see what's on the list and then see how you feel about it, whether you're interested in reading them or not. But yeah, we'll see on July 24th what the actual long list of the prize is. Let me know in the comments below if there's any books that you're really rooting for, that you're hoping to see on the list, that were published in the past year. Or let me know any of your thoughts on any of these books that I've mentioned or talked about, or ones that I haven't read yet that you think I should get to. So I'll speak to you again soon. I'll make another, I'm going to do a special video for the long list announcement, and that'll be exciting to see. So here's the start of the season, and very exciting to follow the prize this year. So I'll speak to you again soon. Bye everyone.